Welcome to French history. So, last lesson we were looking at the trial and execution of Louis and how that was orchestrated by the newly elected National Convention, a Republican government that existed and served as the executive and legislative power in France following the removal of the monarchy by September 1792. In today's lesson, I just want to take a little step back a moment from carrying on with the course content and do a bit of source skills practice. Okay, so we're going to spend some time evaluating what makes a successful response to the source question in paper 2, which is the French paper, and then we will practice our own response later in the lesson. Okay, so we know that on paper 2, which is the France Revolution paper, we have a compulsory source question, and you'll have 3 sources, but we're only going to be practicing 1 today, and each of them is evaluated in its own individual mini essay. And you'll have an hour in total to do this in the real thing, and sources are defined as primary evidence. Okay, so they'll always be from the time, they'll always be contemporary to the events in which they are discussing. Okay, they might be slightly afterwards, but they will be from the similar period, okay, which is in contrast with the extracts from secondary historians that you look at on paper 1. Okay, so it has some similarities with the extract question you do on paper 1 because accuracy does come into the sources question, but here we are thinking specifically about value, and it's this value question that is a little bit more perhaps tricky to get hold of because the sources could be accurate and they could be valuable, but they could also be inaccurate and still be valuable or more valuable because they're inaccurate. Okay, so there is a good discussion of this on the History Rocks podcast. You can get on the podcast app. It's got lots of tips on how to write things in A-level AQA history. So I would recommend that if you are finding it difficult to get your head around how to write essays and how to do the technique for different questions. So let's just have a little look at the mark scheme for this. It's a simplified mark scheme, but it's hopefully making it easier for you to understand what you've got to do in this question. Okay, so you can see on the first column here, it says you've got to talk about the provenance, tone and content. Okay, so you've got to evaluate the relevance of the provenance, the relevance of the tone and the relevance of the content in making the source valuable to a historian for a particular inquiry or not. So if you do that really well, you'd get in level 5. If you did a good job on looking at those, you would get into level 4. If you were reasonable, but you did some things better than others, then you would be in level 3. If it was partial, so it lacked a bit of development, there was a lot more you could have said, it would be level 2. And if you don't show much understanding of the source at all, you'd be in level 1. Okay, but the key here is that what the exam board are looking is they're not looking for you to evaluate these sources standalone. They're not looking for a generic response. Remember I said a minute ago that all of these sources that you'll be looking at on paper 2 will always be primary sources. Okay, so they're not looking for the kind of old style history question responses, for people to be saying things like someone was there from the time so they knew what was going on, or it's a newspaper report so it's trying to persuade you. What they are looking for is for you to make that really specific to the actual source that you've got in front of you. And that's why they've put a whole focus here on context. Okay, so what they really want you to be able to do is say, okay, it's a newspaper, but what newspaper is it and what country is that from and what has that got to do with the situation in France at that particular time that it was published? What exactly has just happened? Who exactly are these people that are writing these things, and what is their role been in events? So they're looking for really specific comments showing a really strong, good understanding of the historical context, and they want you to make sure that you're linking your evaluation of the value of the source to the question. So you're not just, like I said before, evaluating them in isolation. If they've asked you about the value of the source for a particular purpose that we'll look at in a minute, then that's what they want you to link its value back to. Okay, that's how you can assess its value, because sources are only valuable to certain inquiries. They don't have kind of implied value on their own, do they? Okay, think about it like a historian who's gone into the archives, he's rolled his sleeves up and he's looking in the archives, he's writing a paper on a particular focus. He's looking for sources that are going to be valuable to him or her in writing that paper, isn't he? All the sources in the archive are valuable in some way, but it's up to him to spot which ones are going to be most valuable for that particular inquiry. And that's the same process that you're doing here, and that's exactly why this question exists on your A-level, is because the examiners and the exam board want to see that you understand the historical process. Okay, so you're assessed on how specific your understanding of the context is and how well you link the discussion of value to the particular question stem here. And then finally, are you analysing and evaluating, or are you just describing? So if you've got a balanced and supported judgment based on the value, having looked at the provenance, tone and content and linked it with all the historical context and to this specific question focus, then you'd be getting into level 5. If it's only partly substantiated, there's maybe some parts of it that aren't fully analytical, then it'd be level 4. There's some analysis, but it's maybe a bit more descriptive, level 3, and it's undeveloped, or you've only done it on 2 sources, then it would be level 2. Okay, so hopefully that's been helpful in some way in helping you understand what you've got to do in this question. This is the exact question that we're going to be starting off with, okay? So with reference to these sources and your understanding of the context, assess the value of these sources to this historian. So that's what you need to evaluate. What value do they have? Studying the failure of constitutional monarchy. Okay, that is the focus, the failure of constitutional monarchy in the dates, 1792 to 93. Okay, so you've got to say, if you were a historian trying to understand why constitutional monarchy failed, what can you learn from the 3 sources that will be supplied? Okay, that's the basic gist of it. Okay, so we've talked about this before, and we've said that in the French and Revolution course, there's types of sources that we might expect from it being an 18th and 19th century course. But the things that you can see at the top of the screen are the type of things that we might expect to see, and therefore we can kind of predict, can't we, the kind of things that we can say about these things. Okay, these are the kind of reasons why certain sources might be valuable. Okay, so the sources that we're going to be doing a little bit of a focus on in a minute, you can see just listed at the bottom. You've got source A, the written proclamation by Louis before the flight of Varennes. You've looked at that before when you did that topic. Source B, a petition from the Jacobin Club to the Legislative Assembly. We haven't looked at this source, and it's probably the most challenging one here. And source C, the record of Louis's trial, his indictment, which we looked at last lesson. Okay, so just pause the video a minute and think to yourself, without having read the source, can you maybe think what might the value of each of these 3 things be in for the historian trying to understand the failure of constitutional monarchy? If you had to pick which of the blue boxes above would link in or be really a reason why each would be valuable, which would you pick? So pause the video now and just think about that. Okay, so for source A, well, I'll bring it up. I mean, the answer is, when I did this task, what you kind of come out with is that all of these reasons tend to apply a lot of the time. Okay, so often these sources are very political. Okay, so you've got the written proclamation by Louis, you've got the Jacobin Club, and you've got his trial record. All of these are actions done by the government or people petitioning the government. So it kind of shows you something about the position of the government, either why they do what they do or who's critical of what they're doing. It gives you an insight into politics. Okay, and all of them are written by people who had political influence at the time and then go on to have a role in the failure of constitutional monarchy. Okay, and it tells you their kind of methodology for a lot of it. So the written proclamation by Louis tells you why he ran away. The petition from the Jacobin Club tells you why they don't like constitutional monarchy, which is why they end up colluding with the sans-culottes to bring it down. And Louis's trial record tells you, like we saw last lesson, why they justified his execution. They also tell us the causes and consequences of an event. They tell us why opinion turned against the monarchy. They tell us why there was popular action against the Legislative Assembly in 1792. And they tell us why Louis was executed. And they also give us an insight into the consequences of those things. The content is very valuable in all of them. And the question of whether they're typical or not is quite an interesting one. In the responses we'll see in a minute, there's quite an interesting discussion of how Louis's reasoning and views on the political situation in France when he fled to Varennes in 1791 are not actually an accurate assessment of the political landscape, and actually they do a good job in explaining how that is in itself quite helpful in understanding why constitutional monarchy failed. So coming back to that, we could say that some of them are quite inaccurate, like the first one, so is quite helpful, but and like source C, like we looked at last time about how they accused him of lots of things that he didn't actually do, it provides evidence, doesn't it, to understand how the political landscape has changed and why these events were able to take place in the way they were. Okay, so I think the point here is that we're looking for similar things in all sources, and that's quite helpful, isn't it? Because I think sometimes when you've got, the possibility of lots of different types of sources coming up, it can be quite worrying to think, how will I know what to write? Well, often you're just looking for the same thing, aren't you? You're looking for, does it show me what has just happened? Does it show me what's going to happen in a minute? Does it show me something about the role of the people involved? Does it show me, are they intentionally being inaccurate, or are they inaccurate without realising it? In which case that tells you something, doesn't it? Okay, so what I want you to do now is I want you to go to the Word document on the assignment, and you've got a specimen answer. Okay, what I'd like you to do on that assignment is colour code it with 4 colours, okay, into reference to the provenance, reference to the content and context. So anything to do with context is kind of where they bring in their own knowledge, so facts that aren't stated in the source to explain what the value is in terms of what it tells you about what's just gone on. The tone and the emphasis, remember the tone is the kind of, the sort of the message conveyed through the way the words are chosen and the sort of style of it, I suppose. And the emphasis is what they really focus on, what have they chosen to select and include and what they haven't. Limitations in another colour, so anything that you think is not valuable about it or is a weakness of it. And then any time they analyse the value in another colour. Okay, so can you do that on the specimen answers? It'll probably take you a good 15 minutes or so. And while you're doing that, think to yourself, having just discussed the mark scheme, why is this a successful answer? Try to make a list underneath if you can. What makes this a really high level response to the source question? So pause the video now, go to the specimen answers on the Word document, complete this activity, and then come back to get a bit more discussion on it. Okay, so the principal examiner that supposedly marked this said this is a level 5 answer, it's an excellent answer, it's controlled, relevant, consistently evaluative and accurately and appropriately deploys knowledge of context to consider provenance, tone and content of each source. Okay, so it's a very strong level 5, and I think for me the things that really stand out in this answer is that there's nowhere in this answer that they're describing, are they? They're always evaluating value right from the outset. So they've clearly thought about who wrote it, when they wrote it, what was going on, but they haven't spent time describing it. They've gone straight to the analysis right from the outset. Okay, and that's just the same with your essay writing skills. That's exactly what you should be doing. You should be leading with argument, leading with analysis, rather than describing and then saying what that shows. Okay, and they also use lots of short quotes, which shows that they are really focused on evaluating the sources. 2 to 3 word quotes are really good way of showing that you're really evaluating what the content is. They refer to the content, context, provenance, tone, emphasis as relevant. Okay, so tone won't always be relevant, and the exam will realise that. So if it's a legal document and it's kind of just a sort of matter of fact tone, then I wouldn't necessarily refer to that because it doesn't have a bearing on the value. But provenance and content always will. So like I said, they focus on value throughout. And the thing that I think is really valuable in you reading these is that they have a lot of context in them. Okay, the number one thing that I always write on people's answers when they do these source responses is more context, please. Show me what you know about this topic. Okay, and it's not that you've got to just rattle off a load of facts that you know, but you've got to put the source in context. Put the source. Think of the source as like it's a piece of a jigsaw puzzle, and it's your job as a historian to be able to visualise what's going on around it, and therefore what light does this particular source cast onto those events that have just happened, are going on at the same time, or about to happen. Okay, that's how you do this question. You've got to be able to identify how this source fits in and what it can tell you about all that, and refer to all that in order to assess its value. Okay, and they do that precisely here with lots of key terms, with dates, with accuracy. For example, they talk about the Brunswick Manifesto. That's a detailed level of discussion of the context. And analysis of value is linked to the question stem. So this is what I was trying to get across when I was talking about the mark scheme. Value doesn't exist on its own. Okay, all sources are valuable, but some are more valuable than others depending on what you're trying to find out. So here, I do a really good job in talking about the how the sources are valuable in understanding the failure of constitutional monarchy. So they don't, for example, get confused between accuracy and value. That's something that happens quite a lot on this question when people do their responses. They get their sort of knickers in a twist a bit when they say, oh, well, is it accurate? What does that mean? It's not valuable, but are they intending to make it inaccurate, or does that mean it's valuable or not valuable? Here, they've got a really clear handle on that. So, for example, A is judged to be valuable because it is inaccurate, because it shows Louis didn't realise that he didn't necessarily have the support of the French people. And B, because it is an extremist view, and therefore, because it's so extremist, it shows us that there was this politically extreme element in French society by 1792 that was willing to act out violently against the monarchy. And there were different political opinions. So they do a good job here in making sure that although they discuss the accuracy, and that's perhaps some of the limitations they point to, they still come back to the question stem, which is, what do they tell me about the reasons why constitutional monarchy failed? Well, these sources tell me a great deal because they show me how much of a gulf there is in the political opinions of Louis in A, the extremists in B, which resulted in the execution scene in C. And their limitations are sophisticated, they're not generic, okay? So they don't say those kind of generic statements like, they didn't talk about this, so it's not a very valuable source. They didn't mention this event that's also going on at the same time. That judging on a mission, unless a mission, like not including things, is intentional to either mislead or because they don't know enough information, then that's not a very strong way to point to limitations of a source. You're much better saying, talking about the limitations based on the provenance and who it was, or if they intentionally omit things from the content. Like, for example, the Jacobin point of view was intentionally very negative, wasn't it, about the monarchy? Okay, and final thought on this is they do have a little summary where they conclude and they kind of combine them all. And I would say this is not required and it's not something that's ever been recommended to do, but in the next breath it does show an understanding of where the value of each of these sources lie in the wider narrative of why constitutional monarchy failed. So it's something you can consider, but I think that the earlier part of the talking about and analysing the value of the provenance, tone, content and context, that is much, much more important. So hopefully that's been helpful in giving you some really high quality exemplars of the sort of writing we're expecting you to do on these sources. Now, let's remind ourselves of this source that we looked at in the live lesson last week, okay? The British newspaper report 5 days after Louis's execution, talking about the event. Okay, now what I would like you to do for homework, and you can start it now in the lesson, is to write a response using the technique and the tips you've picked up from just analysing those 3 ones about the failure of constitutional monarchy to answer this question on this source only, just one. Okay, so with reference to this source and your understanding of the historical context, assess the value of this source to a historian studying Louis's trial and execution. Okay, so what value does this have? What does it tell you about Louis's trial and execution? Okay, so coming back to our thing here, we could, we already talked about this last lesson, so hopefully you've already got a bit of an idea. Oh, sorry, that should say this source, that it tells you a bit about, how this was reported. And it's a newspaper report, so it's going to be reported in Britain. This is going to be the impression that people in Britain have of this event, isn't it? It shows us that the British government were obviously not very keen on the fact that, put it mildly, the fact that Louis had been executed, because there's a lot of threats there and recommendations that they needed to go and do something about these ruthless French dogs, and that perhaps shows us their motivations for why the British become involved in the War of the First Coalition a few months later. Okay, so it kind of shows us the reason why the war widened in 1793. We could talk about the content, and we talked about this, didn't we, in the lesson, about how the content is very highly pro-monarchy, and there's lots of references there to him being a martyr and him being a hero, and the sort of sympathy that's kind of brought across by all the references to his family and these farewells and his ancestors and things like that. And we said, didn't we, that there was perhaps a question mark over its accuracy, because the likelihood is that this information would have come from a sort of counter-revolutionary or a monarchist living in France, and so they themselves would be very pro-monarchy, and things like, the reaction of the Parisians to Louis's execution or hiding inside their houses might not have been a true picture of the opinions of the French people at all. Okay, so hopefully that's been a bit of a recap. What I want you to do is I want you to use these sentence starters to evaluate that source. Okay, so here's your structure. Okay, so I want one sentence about the value of the content and the context. So what does it tell you with quotes, and what does it tell you about Louis's execution, about what's just happened and about what's about to happen? Okay, so you've got the sentence starter over here, the content of this source, because it gives an insight into the context of the time, what's going on, what does it tell us, okay? I want 2 to 3 sentences on the value, so these can all be mini paragraphs, these ones on the left, okay, on the value of the provenance, tone and emphasis, okay? So the emphasis of the source is valuable because what does it try and get across about Louis and his execution? It's valuable with regards to the provenance. Why is it valuable that it's come from a British newspaper? Why is the tone valuable, this sympathetic tone, or this kind of heart-rending tone that it's got there? And then I want another little paragraph on the limitations. Okay, that's the tricky bit. It's quite a good one to do limitations on those. So it could be anything to do with the tone, the content, or the provenance for limitations. And then I want an overall conclusion. And it says here, where does the value of this source lie? Okay, so it's about Louis's execution, and it's from a British newspaper who then become the enemy of France. So it's going to have value, isn't it? But where is its value lie? What is valuable particularly about it? In particular, does it tell you about, the international reaction to Louis's execution? Does it tell you about how controversial this event was? Does it tell you about the reasons why the revolution became fractured in 1793? These are things which you will know more about over the next few weeks as well. Okay, so you're looking to write about 3/4 of a side to a side, typed or handwritten, preferably typed if you don't mind. Okay, and I would like that by Wednesday the 17th of March. Now, final thought to help you is you've also got attached to the assignment this source skills mat. I will give you an actual copy of this when we're back in school in a couple of weeks, with just lots of helpful tips on it in terms of reasons why things might be valuable, in terms of its provenance, some words that you can use when talking about tone, the damn it prompts to things to think about, you know, that you could be relevant. Not all of them will be relevant, but they could be relevant. And you've also got just some other helpful phrases, some structuring tips, and just some other top tips here. Okay, so we'll finish it there. If there's any questions about any of that, obviously just message me on Teams, and hopefully this is going to be a useful set of exercises in you improving your confidence with your sourcing and evaluation skills.